Hi everyone, it's Miss Stefan, and I'm bringing you your next lesson about famous inventors and their inventions. So today we're going to be exploring the life of George Washington Carver. Last time we talked, you guys were learning about Thomas Edison and what his life was like, the problems that he wanted to solve with his inventions, and the things that he invented and created. So just for this week, I want to first take you back to look at our overall unit on inventors and inventions, just for some background information. So remember, inventor is one who invents, especially a new device or process. Invention, something invented, like a new gadget, device, machine, or method. And then I just want you to remember our guiding questions that are going to guide us through as we start this book on George Washington Carver. So go ahead, get your paper ready, and just write down these questions again. We're going to start and just do half of the book today because it's a little bit longer book and it has a lot of important information and background information in it. So I want to make sure that I don't run too long on the video and just give you time to really think about it. We'll break it into two parts. So our guiding questions for today are, what was the process of discovery like for George Washington Carver? What are some of his inventions? And what is an example of one of his inventions that helped solve a problem or need of society? And I really want to focus with George Washington Carver on this point about problems and needs of society. Just like all of our other examples, we talked about the doctor who's working on the vaccine for the coronavirus to solve that problem in society. And we talked about Thomas Edison, how we had electricity when he was alive, but there was no way to bring it into people's homes. So that was a problem and need as well. Just like the other famous inventors we've learned about, George Washington Carver was really driven by helping to improve society. So we're really going to stop and zoom in on some of the problems that were going on then and how he wanted to help them. And then just remember, we have our 2N tasks coming up. I extended the deadline because I wanted to give you time last week to do an Earth Day video instead, because that's a really important topic to learn about. So instead, you're going to have to do still the compare and contrast, but since we're going to break this book up into two parts this week, the whole project is going to be due on 5/6/20, so that's next Wednesday. So you're still going to be taking your notes on George Washington Carver, using your notes from last week on Thomas Edison, and then you're going to put it all together to write a 3-paragraph essay comparing and contrasting how their inventions impacted society. Okay? And then next week, we'll get into the next project of creating your own invention. So now that you have your notes, let's go ahead and start our lesson for today. I'm going to go ahead and read it to you because I think it might sound a little bit better and it will move and sound a little more natural when I read than when the book reads. But definitely when you go back on your own into Epic and you're rereading, you could listen and follow along. It'll really help you to understand these more difficult words. So again, we're reading about George Washington Carver. This is National Geographic Readers, George Washington Carver. Yum! Meet the inventor of peanut butter, George Washington Carver, and learn about his important work with peanuts and other plants. Okay, so we see our table of contents. Who was Carver? Growing up, in his time, a love of learning, and that's where we're going to stop today. And then tomorrow we'll do the rest of the book. Okay, so I'll hold off on those other chapters. Who was Carver? George Washington Carver loved studying plants. He showed farmers how to grow sustainable crops. That helped them farm better and eat better. Sustainable, if we look down here, it shows in our words to know, means grown in a way that keeps the soil healthy. And already I'm thinking, why might that be important? Well, think about it. If a farmer has healthy soil, it's easier for him time and time again to plant new crops and to plant them over and over season after season. So already he was problem solving with his work with plants. He also found that hundreds of things could be made from peanut plants. Growing peanuts helped farmers earn money. And here's a painting of George Washington Carver from 1942. In Carver's time, life was hard for many Black people in the United States. They did not have the same rights as white people. Carver felt this was wrong. He used his ideas about farming to help change people's lives. So this is where I really want to stop. This is something that is really, really important to understand about George Washington Carver. How we talked about how problems and needs of society are what drive our inventors to create special inventions or new things to make life better or easier. He was so upset that Black and white people did not have equal rights in America. At this time, let's see what happened. We see this illustration here, and it says many Black farmers were too poor to buy their own land. Instead, they had to rent it, like you would rent an apartment. They would actually rent the land that they were going to grow their crops on. And they had to pay the owner a share of their crops. So for all the hard work that the farmers were putting into their land, for the Black farmers, they couldn't keep the profit. They had to give most of it to the people who owned the land. And that ended up usually being white people. So Carver, like we mentioned, he felt this was very wrong. So this is something driving him to make a better invention to make people's lives better. Let's see what his life was like growing up. We have our heading right here telling us this whole section is going to be about what his life was like when he was a kid. George Washington Carver was born on a farm near Diamond, Missouri, in the United States. Most people think he was born around 1864. No one knows for sure, but we do know he was born a slave. Back then, slaves were often given their owner's last name. George's owners were Moses and Susan Carver, so his last name was Carver too. So when you picture this inventor, George Washington Carver, he lived a long time ago. In 1864 is when he was born. So he lived at a time when he was born, it was into slavery. And then things in the United States actually ended up changing in his lifetime. So this is taking us back so we can understand what his childhood was like and where he came from. And that really helps us to see how this experience shaped his life as an inventor. Here's a picture here, and it actually shows the cabin where Carver lived as a boy is gone. But this outline, the picture above, was built later to show how small it was. This sketch on the right was drawn by Carver himself. It shows how he remembers the cabin. So if you see, even where he lived was a very small area. He was born into a very difficult childhood. Enslave, a person who is owned by another person, in our words to know caption. So I just want to pause a second. So already we have some information here. When we think about the process of discovery for George Washington Carver, we already know that his childhood was incredibly difficult and painful, being born into slavery. And then throughout his life, he saw that Black and white people were not treated equally. And this was something that encouraged him and motivated him to make new inventions and to make life better. We could also list some of this under the problems and needs of society. We see that Black farmers were called sharecroppers, and they actually had to give away a lot of their money after they were farming because they didn't own the land themselves. We'll get into more of his inventions later on after we learn more about the history of his life. Okay. One night, men kidnapped baby George Carver and his mother. He was returned to the farm, but his mother was not. Again, we know he had an incredibly difficult childhood. Soon after, slavery ended. Moses and Susan Carver decided to raise George. As a boy, he loved to explore the farm. He collected rocks. He grew a garden. He asked questions. So ever since he was a child, even though he went through a lot of difficult experiences, he was always somebody who wanted to learn. He was always interested in gardening and nature and asking a lot of questions about science and trying to find answers. Here we see a statue of him as a child, and this is actually in Diamond, Missouri. This was the first national monument to honor an African American person. So this is incredibly important, and you couldn't see how important he was in the history of our entire country. And here we have a caption in his own words. When I talk to the little flower or the little peanut, they will give up their secrets. He really respected the plants that he grew, and he spent a lot of time in nature and outside learning about the science behind the plants so that he could help in coming up with new inventions and improvements in farming. And then we see in his time, life was incredibly different then. So the author of this book wanted to give us some images about things that we have in our life too, like food and school, and compare how things were then to how they are now. So Carver grew up in the Midwestern United States during the 1870s. Back then, many things were different from how they are today. Transportation, many people actually traveled on foot or in wagons with horses or steamboats or trains. People didn't get around in cars and buses and on the metro like we do today. So that was something incredibly different. In school, children went to school in one-room schoolhouses and even old barns. For food, few people shopped in stores for food. Instead, they raised farm animals. They also grew fruits and vegetables to feed their families. So back then, life was very different in that you couldn't go to the Safeway or to Giant. People actually had to raise their own food. And so you can see farmers were one of the most important people in the community because they produced a lot of the food that not only they needed to sell, but they also needed just to keep their own families alive. And that was more of the reason that he really wanted to do work around food and farmers. We see that U.S. events in 1872, Ulysses S. Grant was reelected President of the United States. Toys and fun, children spent time outdoors and they played with handmade toys. And as far as money, most freed slaves had little or no money, so they often traded for things they needed. So they would swap items instead of using money to pay for it. Because like we said back in earlier in the book, one of the problems was that a lot of the freed slaves were now working as sharecroppers, so they couldn't even keep all of the money that they earned from raising crops. Okay, we're going to read this last page today to see about a love of learning, and this is where our story changes a bit. Now we're going to get into the section about how George Washington Carver started his experience as a student and how he started learning and how this is going to push him to be an inventor. A love of learning. Carver loved to learn, but in his town, Black children could not go to school. Again, remember, in this time, it was very unfair. Life was completely different for Black and white children. And this is one of the examples. Black children could not even go to school. It was a really terrible history in our country. Carver learned to read at home. He had only one book. And in his own words in this caption, my soul thirsted for an education. In spite of all of these difficulties, no matter what, he wanted to learn. And this drawing shows a school for Black children during Carver's time. Carver wanted to learn more. At around age 13, he left home. He lived with a Black family in a nearby town. There, he went to a school for Black children. So finally, at age 13, he moves away and he gets the experience to go to school that he had wanted. So we're going to pick up again tomorrow, and we're going to see what happens when George Washington Carver wants to go on to university, the struggles and difficulties he's going to face, and then how he starts once he's in college to become an inventor and to be able to solve these problems that he's been seeing and experiencing since his childhood. So just take a minute and let's just go back through our guiding questions so you make sure you have everything written down. What was the process of discovery like for George Washington Carver? We already have some ideas and notes about his childhood and his experience in getting education no matter what. What are some of his inventions? We haven't talked about that yet. That's going to be tomorrow in the second part of our book. What is an example of one of his inventions that helped solve a problem or need of society? And we already see some of the problems and needs that he's experienced in his life and that he's seen that's going to drive him to create new inventions as he gets older. So thank you guys for following along today in our book. And we're going to go ahead and continue tomorrow. Make sure you take your notes. Make sure you go onto Epic. You could go back and do your second read. You could read all the way through if you want ahead of our next part of the lesson, or wait for me and just do the first half before tomorrow. And I'll be seeing you guys tomorrow.